So if you really appreciate West Slope Ag and you're interested in it, you'll want to hang for this last presentation. The words demand management have been bandied about, and of course a lot of concern is that ag, where does that fall in that discussion? And the obvious answer would be, it's going to fall largely because that's where the water is. So there's a lot of concern about that. What are the unintended consequences? Even though it's going to be voluntary, what are those who volunteer to fallow their land? What will that mean? So Sonja Chavez, who's on the Colorado River District staff, she's a water resources specialist and our representative to the Water Bank Work Group, and Doug Jeavons, who's works with BBC Consulting and Research, have been exploring this topic, and we're going to bring them to the stage. And Sonja, you're going to go first.
Thanks, Jim, and good afternoon, everyone. I've been asked to kick off this afternoon's presentation by introducing you to the Colorado River Water Bank Work Group. The Colorado River Water Bank Work Group is paying for and it's sponsored to pay for the secondary economic impact study on West Slope agricultural communities that BBC Research and Consulting is doing on our behalf. The Water Bank Work Group originally grew out of a 2008 meeting of the Colorado River District and the Southwestern Water Conservation District over concerns related to ongoing drought and the potential impact of compact curtailment on Colorado River water users, especially post-compact water users on the West Slope. The Water Bank Work Group is composed of the Colorado River District, Southwestern Water Conservation District, the Nature Conservancy, Upper Gunnison River Water Conservancy District, Uncompahgre Valley Water Users Association, Grand Valley Water Users Association, and Tri-State Generation and Transmission. The Colorado Water Conservation Board also participates in an advisory role and provides funding for the various water banking studies, or has provided funding. Our mission and goal is to investigate possible solutions that strike a balance between urban, agricultural, environmental, and industrial needs that address Colorado's compact obligations while also avoiding solutions that result in the dry up of West Slope agriculture and potential disruption to our local economies and way of life. Our West Slope communities are diverse and in many cases are isolated from major urban areas. That's one of the reasons why many of us even choose to call the West Slope home and why so many people come to visit us. We have a slower pace of life, abundant recreational opportunities, boating, fishing, camping, hiking, paddleboarding, mountain biking, and skiing, to name a few. In addition, we have beautiful mountains, quiet ranching communities, amazing farmers markets flush with fresh vegetables and fruits, quaint downtown communities with specialty shops and restaurants, and some pretty cool festivals. And with all that wonderful uniqueness come big challenges as we embark on studying demand management, water banking, and the secondary economic impacts associated with it. While I don't have time today to take you into a deep dive on the various studies that the Water Bank Work Group has sponsored, I did want to give you a 30,000-foot overview. The Water Bank Work Group has studied both the supply and demand side of water banking. We've evaluated the potential size of a bank and its frequency of use. We've studied the potential for demand management and water banking in 8 representative irrigation systems on the West Slope. We've done qualitative assessments of barriers and opportunities identified by potential water bank participants. We've prepared technical memos and reviews of agricultural consumptive uses. We've taken a quick look into compact water bank pricing. We've studied the impacts of split season irrigation on forage yield, the use of specialty crops and crop rotations, and the impacts of deficit irrigation on soil health. And we've supported conserved consumptive use pilot projects, such as those in the Grand Valley, as a means of furthering discussions into a voluntary, temporary, and compensated program. As you will hear more today, we are taking a detailed look at the potential secondary economic impacts of demand management on the West Slope communities. Throughout this study and related efforts of the River District, in its evaluation of demand management, we are and will continue to carry out a robust public education and input process by reaching out to the general public at seminars like this, addressing water users and water providers, consulting with industry, recreation, and the like. We will have public meetings, present study findings via webinars, and we will continue to encourage folks to provide input via our website, by reaching out to staff directly, and by inviting us to your community meetings. So what did we learn? We've learned that opportunities and challenges are going to vary depending upon the geographic location, the type of system, whether it be private, federal, or tribal, and we know that one size definitely does not fit all. The impacts of reduced consumptive use, if not implemented thoughtfully, may extend beyond the immediate location of the project and into local communities and even the state of Colorado as a whole. The decision to participate in a water bank is not just about economics. There are also concerns from water bank participants or potential participants about impacts to neighbors, family history, loss of heritage or way of life, impacts to wildlife, and impacts to Main Street and downtown. We also know that the administration, contracting, and shepherding of Save Water still continues to be a major unknown in this discussion. We know that water marketing and pricing is also still mostly unknown, and we know that simply using crop budgets to calculate payments for reduced consumptive use may not fully compensate landowners for participation, especially in cases where you have slow yield recovery and longer-term impacts to your operation. If you look at the distribution of irrigated acreage by crop type, over 79% is in alfalfa and grass pasture. I've heard assumptions and statements being made that the majority of conserved consumptive use will come from these areas. But if you examine them more closely, we find that not much research has been done at higher elevations on deficit irrigation. And if you look at that and you think about that, with reduced yields at higher elevations and with ranching operations closely tied to grass and hay production, a landowner who participates in the water bank work group is not going to go out and buy supplemental feed to feed their cows. The first thing they're going to do is reduce their herd size. When you talk about reducing your herd size, you talk about impacting your genetics that have taken 15, 20, 30, or more years to develop. With regard to crops and irrigation, we know that alfalfa is resilient and it adapts to irrigation stress pretty well. We know that the deficit irrigation regime that you may choose to employ will have an impact on your overall yield and your field's recovery. It's likely going to be important for landowners to have flexibility with regard to the potential participation in a water bank, because they have to consider crop rotation and other farm management decisions well in advance. We don't yet have an agreement on how we will measure conserved consumptive use. This will likely be a decision and a discussion that might have to take place between the upper basin states and the lower basin states. And we know that in order to minimize or avoid negative economic impacts, the development of a water bank should take place incrementally over a period of time versus being a single-year knee-jerk reaction to a crisis. Finally, I want to acknowledge that there is still a significant amount of work to be done, hard questions to be asked, and difficult conversations to be had. It's imperative that we have a strong foundation of knowledge as we proceed in exploring demand management and water banking in Colorado. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and I am now going to turn things over to Doug Jeavons. I'm happy to answer any questions or take any input at the end of his presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sonja, and how about a shout out for Jim, who's been making this all work all day today. And I think also maybe a little shout out to the audience. So you all have endured 6 hours now of very interesting but sometimes depressing presentations about meteorology, hydrology, administrative and legal issues, and now you're being rewarded with an economics presentation at the end. So my apologies for that, but we'll try to make it kind of interesting. So as Sonja mentioned, I think the title for our study is a little bit strange. Well, she didn't say it that way, but it's entitled A Secondary Economic Impact Study. And the reason for that is that the presumption that we are operating under is that if there is ever a demand management program, and I emphasize the if, it would be voluntary and compensated. So the presumption is that the participants would only choose to participate if they were being compensated at a level where it made sense to them. And we'll talk more about this in a little bit later, but certainly for the program to be sustainable on an ongoing basis, that would have to be true. The real concern is in regard to what some folks would call secondary impacts, others would call third-party impacts or unintended consequences, and that's really kind of the focus of our study. This is a sort of a big picture study. Our focus is on Western Colorado as a whole and on the 4 basins as defined in the Basin Roundtable process. So that's a challenge too, because as we'll get into in a little bit, a lot of the issues associated with demand management are very much at the micro scale or at the farm level, farmer ditch company level. There are 4 overall tasks in our study, and with one task probably having the greatest importance of all of them, and that's not the economic baseline, but that's where we started. So the beginning component really was to examine recent and current economic data, agricultural data, and trends throughout Western Colorado, and document those. And as I mentioned, the most important task of the 4 in our study is the non-technical task of stakeholder input, and we'll talk a little bit more about that process. But at this point in time, we have developed preliminary economic baseline information for all the basins, and we have had an initial round of meetings with stakeholder groups, which are almost like focus groups in each of the 4 basins. A second technical element, third overall task in the study is what was termed framework development in the RFP and in our contract, which really means developing the models and assumptions that we will use to estimate the economic impacts, and also developing the demand management scenarios that we'll take a look at. And I think some of the discussion that John just provided in regard to the risk study can certainly be useful in helping to identify what some of the scenarios are that we may want to look at here. Again, the framework, the sort of overall structure of the framework has been discussed with each of the stakeholder groups in each basin. We'll be coming back to them later in the next round of meetings with preliminary results after the scenarios are defined, and we have some quantitative estimates of what some of the economic impacts could be. I'll share a few insights from the economic baseline that I think are interesting, kind of focusing primarily on agricultural information. One of the things that's interesting about Western Colorado is that when you start looking at agricultural census data, Census of Agricultural data from 2017, the initial reaction is there's a lot of farms in Western Colorado. The Census of Ag identifies about 11,800 quote-unquote farms across the 4 basins. But when you start comparing that to employment data from Bureau of Economic Analysis and other sources, there's a lot fewer farmers than you might expect to be associated with so many farms. And the reason for that, there's several reasons for that. First of all, about 60 to 70% of the producers on the farms as defined in the Census of Agriculture primarily work off farm. Half of the farms in the Census of Agriculture produced less than $2,500 in 2017. And so when you look at those factors, it's not too surprising that the median farm size across Western Colorado is actually very small. And this is a phenomena that I think those of you that live here know well. If you look at this summary of the 2017 Ag Census data and you kind of focus on the right-hand column, again, there's that 11,800 farms number. The average size of the farms is pretty substantial, big enough to be a commercial operation at almost 500 acres. But the median size, remembering the difference between averages and medians, half the farms are smaller and half the farms are bigger. The median size is less than 55 acres. A couple other items of note from the 2017 Ag Census. The market value of production was about $515 million in 2017. About 60%, 65% of that was from livestock production, the remainder being from crop and hay production. And I guess a positive note is that if you compare the 2017 market value of production data to 2007, 10 years ago, and adjust for inflation, the market value in 2017 was about 17% greater, even after adjusting for inflation, than it was in 2007. Carrying over kind of the information in terms of the number of farmers, number of farm jobs, you know, one thing that's interesting is to compare the size of the agricultural sector to some of the other key drivers in Western Colorado, and particularly tourism. And so if you look at the bottom portion of this slide, again, we have about 13,600 people working directly in farming, and that's full and part-time average annual jobs, according to the Bureau of Economic Analysis. The tourism sector, of course, is much, much bigger. And the tourism numbers here come from the State Demography Office, because tourism is a hard sector to quantify. It doesn't sort of match up with traditional economic definitions. But while the tourism sector is bigger, a lot of that is driven by the Colorado Basin, and in particular all the ski resorts and the large second home communities there. If you look at the other three basins in Western Colorado, there's more balance between agriculture and tourism. I think the other takeaway from this slide, kind of shifting to the top portion of the slide, but again focusing on the bottom line, is that the last decade or so has been tough from an economic standpoint in Western Colorado, and you all know that. You know, it's been a slow recovery at best from the recession. The turmoil or gradual downsizing, or sometimes not so gradual, of the energy industry has had a big impact. And so when we look at Western Colorado as a whole, there's about 410,000 jobs in 2017. That's only up about 9,000 jobs, or less than, a little over 2%, I guess, since 2010. Skipping ahead to consumptive use and irrigated acres and by basin. So overall, and the consumptive use numbers here come from the latest update, the preliminary release to the State Water Plan technical data, which came out in July, which indicates about 1.5 million acre feet per year of consumptive use by agriculture in the four western basins. The number of irrigated acres varies somewhat depending on your source. The smaller numbers here at 690,000 or so comes from the Census of Agriculture. The bigger number comes from the technical update at about 772,000 acres. But either way, the overall average consumptive use is in the range of about 2 to 2.2 acre feet per acre. So what that really means is that if we're talking about a potential demand management program to try to reduce consumptive use by 50,000 acre feet a year, that would involve basically reducing about 25,000 acres of agricultural production. Sonja mentioned cropping patterns. The data from the Colorado Decision Support System crop analyses, which was produced in 2015, indicates that about 79% of crop production is grass hay, about 12% is alfalfa hay, and relatively small numbers for other types of production. So as Sonja mentioned, if there is going to be a demand management program of the scale of potentially 50,000 acre feet per year, very likely it's going to focus heavily on hay production. So as I said, we've gone through the first round of meetings with the stakeholder groups in each of the basins, and I'm going to report back on some of what we heard in our initial discussions with them. In terms of what these stakeholder groups are, they're essentially like focus groups. So they were invited participants across with the intent of getting a representative distribution of the different types of interests that might be affected in each basin. And we have agricultural producers, agricultural service providers, including banks and lenders, implement sales folks, and that sort of thing. Water managers, local governments, folks involved in tourism, marketing, and economic development, environmental representatives, representatives of the recreation industry, and representatives from energy and other types of industry. And we have about a total of about 60 participants across the 4 basins. So we were aiming for, as I said, they're much like focus groups, fairly small groups where we could have a lively and engaged discussion back and forth, not just between us. So it wasn't just us presenting information to them, but trying to really encourage an ongoing dialogue amongst the participants themselves. And what we heard will probably echo with some themes that you've heard earlier today. Very interesting, following the presentation about the risk study, one of the questions that comes out frequently, or has come out in these meetings, was how would the impacts of demand management, the economic impacts of demand management, compare to the impacts of a curtailment? And I think the risk study is contributing or will contribute information that will be very useful in looking at that. I think there's other aspects of that that'll be hard to quantify, probably. Also, a frequent theme, I think, in these discussions was that why should Western Colorado agriculture have to bear the burden for fixing this problem? That other sectors and water users should contribute to the solution. One of the challenges is that there are there are a lot of challenges associated with a potential demand management program, and economics is just one of them. Sometimes it was difficult to keep the participants focused on economic issues because so many of the issues surround issues like water rights and shepherding the water and other types of issues like that. One thing that I think certainly has implications for our economic analysis is that in some of the basins, particularly in the Southwest and in the Yampa and the White, much of the hay production is exported. Obviously, there's hay production for local livestock raising as well, but a substantial portion is exported around the country and all over the world. And then I think one of the interesting wrinkles, excuse me, is we had some lively discussions about hemp. And as you all may know, there's thousands, if not tens of thousands of acres that are being replanted in hemp across Western Colorado as well as other parts of the state now. And for the most part, that isn't really reflected in much of the economic statistics yet. So there's certainly varied views about how successful that will be in the long run, with some folks being very enthusiastic and others pretty skeptical. Some particular concerns associated with the demand management program, and Sonja touched on some of these. One of the things we heard very frequently was concerns about impacts on sort of immediate neighbors of the participants, and particularly in terms of return flows, but also weeds, aesthetics, the need to continue to have return flows to help provide water for augmentation wells, and other issues like that. Impacts to soil health, soil moisture, salinity, and so on were another concern. There was a pretty lively discussion in the Yampa and White Basin stakeholder meeting about the potential for impacts on operators that lease but don't own the land, and there's clearly a potential disconnect that might have to be dealt with in terms of program design to try to avoid situations where absentee landlords basically throw operators off the land if they participate in a program like this. I mentioned at the outset that the voluntary and compensated nature of this kind of program, the basic assumption usually is that means that the participants will be at least as well off if they participate as if they don't, but there were concerns raised about whether folks would fully understand what the long-term implications of their participation might be, even on their own farms. And then I think, moving beyond just some of the agricultural economic statistics, another key point that was brought out in these meetings was that agriculture may not be a terribly large employer in Western Colorado at this stage, but it's a key source of economic stability, especially given what's happened with the energy industry, and that it provides a lot of what economists call non-market benefits, so things that aren't really captured in employment and earning statistics, but the cultural value, the aesthetic value, the recreation value, and the value it contributes to tourism as well. There were also some good observations from the stakeholders about potential ways to try to limit some of the impacts from this kind of program. And one of the key recognitions, and this is nothing new, I don't think, is that if there is such a program, finding a way to disperse it geographically so that the impacts aren't overly concentrated in any one place is a key strategy for minimizing impacts. And that will probably be challenging. It's going to require a highly tailored program, I think, not an unfettered sort of market type program. But it could be a key way to avoid pushing individual communities over a tipping point or past the point of economic resiliency. One of the reasons I brought up the discussion about the smaller farms is that was another active source of discussion, was whether there would be a way to involve some of those farms in this type of program, maybe through ditch companies that serve them or other means of sort of creating a co-op type arrangement. And I think the thinking there was that smaller farms, because they're not really commercial producers, they probably don't, well, we know they don't use as much in terms of inputs, and the economic impacts of reducing their water use may be less. They also may use, in some cases, are believed to use water perhaps less efficiently than the bigger commercial operations do. We had discussion about alternatives to full fallow. The observation that demand management program would have greater impacts in dry years and less in wet years, and some discussion about kind of ground rules for limiting the proportions of farms that could participate. That was a component of the Grand Valley Water Users Association pilot that was conducted in 2018-19, was to have rules like that to try to minimize some of the impacts. And there was also discussion about recognizing that there could be some potential economic benefits from this kind of program as well. And those range from, improved water quality in certain stream segments, potential benefits for communities that have developed boating or fishing or other types of recreation facilities, that the payments themselves could help participants diversify, in a sense, upgrade their farms, improve their equipment, and remain viable. And it might also help some folks transition their farms to different types of crops or organics. You stuck? Maybe.
Yeah, I think it gave up.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll do it without PowerPoint the old-fashioned way. So I think we're pretty much at the stage where I was just going to talk about the next step. So we're about 4 or 5 months into what's really about a 10-month study. And the next real phase for us is to work with the work group representatives on defining the scenarios that we're going to analyze and on providing further detail in terms of the models and the overall framework that we're going to use. At that point, we'll develop some initial estimates of the economic impacts for those scenarios, and we'll head back into another round of meetings with the stakeholders in each of the basins to ground truth some of that information and get their feedback, and then move forward from there. So it's a fascinating study, certainly a diverse range of views and opinions about this. One of the presenters earlier today talked about not shooting the messenger. I certainly had that feeling in that initial round of stakeholder meetings. And had to explain a few times that I wasn't advocating demand management and that our study wouldn't determine for sure whether there was a demand management program or not. It was simply adding more information to that decision process. So, well, thank you again.
Thank you, Doug. And that PowerPoint is frozen, but the unfrozen version will appear on our website, as will the others, Friday night. So as I looked at the information you all presented, it seemed, demand management is a difficult concept anyway, but it almost seems like the numbers are stacked against it. The easier to fallow crops might be annuals, whereas, pastures and orchards and vineyards, nuts, it's really difficult. So I don't know. Is demand management, it has such a built-in difficulty? I mean, that's my observation. I look for some comment.
Yeah, so Jim, you are correct. I think you can't fallow an orchard or a vineyard. That's just a type of crop that requires water on an annual basis. I think you could certainly implement a demand management program, but I think the possibility maybe for doing deficit irrigation versus full fallowing might be more feasible in varying areas of the basin. Certainly, I think looking at the difference in grass and alfalfa and pasture hay crops, high elevation versus lower elevation, that might be another thing to look at as well. So.
Here's a question. Or Doug, did you want to add something?
No, I was just going to agree with Sonja's observation. I mean, the numbers are such, given the cropping patterns, that to get to the sort of scale that 50,000 acre feet a year, you really almost are going to have to involve grass and alfalfa hay producers. And so finding a way to do that's workable is probably a real key if this is going to move forward in any fashion.
Scott.
Does the term farms include ranches on the West Slope?
Yes, it does.
Quick question in the back, Alex.
Yeah, you said voluntary compensated, but you didn't mention temporary. And I'm curious how you're going to address the idea that these are supposed to be temporary demand management program, so these impacts are not intended to be permanent, or are you looking at them as permanent impacts?
No, you're right, and I didn't mention the word temporary because I was focusing more on the compensation aspect. But the temporary component, I think the vision is that is also kind of tied to that geographic dispersion idea, which is that almost like a rotational fallowing program, that essentially the acres involved would move around over time as well, which could certainly help reduce some of the impacts on the neighbors and on aesthetic conditions and some of the other issues. So rather than a permanent fallowing of someone's acreage.
Next question.
I had one. You very briefly touched upon shepherding the water. I know that came up in other conversations that if an upstream diverter banked his water, that it would be promptly picked off by the junior downstream diverters. How do you color it? How do you shepherd it? Just a question.
That's a great question, and I'm really not the right person to answer it because I'm not a hydrologist, I'm an economist. I think it's one of the issues that is being looked at as well. One thing I meant to mention, but I didn't, was that we're obviously not the only folks studying demand management at this point. You've probably gathered that. CWCB does have a series of, or has organized a series of groups to talk about and identify issues, and I think they'll be looking in. I hope that they'll be looking at that in some detail.
Rachel. And then, go ahead, Paul, while the mic comes to Rachel.
Quick question. It seems like to me that demand management is a stick. What about a carrot for efficiency and voluntary compensation, voluntary improving of your water efficiency, water management?
Yeah, I think efficiency is probably, in that toolbox. But I think one thing to recognize is that as you are becoming more efficiency, you're going to increase your crop yield and likely increase your consumptive use. The question is whether your efficiency will result in more water in the stream because you are reducing your overall deliveries to your farm or not, I think. But I think it's part of the conversation.
Thank you both again. I'm wondering a little, I realize this is focusing on agriculture production and the agricultural economy, but on the West Slope, particularly perhaps in the I-70 region, in the resort areas, you have a lot of very large properties that the house pays residential property taxes, but the remainder of the land pays an agricultural, because they're raising hay, of relatively low value, often those $2,500 ones you had listed. What I'm wondering is if we're going to look at a little bit at the impact of this on real estate values. And the Northwest Council of Governments Water QQ Commission had done a study that showed there was significant impact to property taxes and property tax values by the loss of agriculture and the scenic beauty in the areas. And so I just am wondering if you might expand it to other types of economic losses that do come from the loss of agriculture.
Yeah, definitely so. And, to some extent, I think we'll be able to quantify some of those things. To some extent, we won't, but I think it's an important issue. You mentioned folks that are raising hay and on small farms or small ranches, primarily to get the agricultural property tax exemption. And that's where some of the discussion in those stakeholder groups came about of, is there a way to involve folks like this in this kind of program? There were a lot of concerns raised that if folks like that were, well, a couple issues come up. One is, can you really incentivize those folks with money, given that their economic circumstance, to get them to be a participant in a program like this? And two was whether, what sort of level of education and technical expertise would need to be provided to avoid a lot of unintended impacts if they were to simply stop irrigating those properties.
Steve.
As I'm sure you know, in this state, we have very stringent stormwater management requirements, and disturbed sites, such as construction sites or energy development sites, spend a lot of money on mitigating stormwater impacts. And those rules are stringently enforced, and especially if we're fallowing land upriver, where the properties tend to have a significant slope to them. I think erosion and siltation of our streamways and rivers is going to be an issue, and I'd recommend touching base with the Colorado Water Quality Control Commission that sets those regulations, and determine how removing vegetation from agricultural properties is going to fit into stormwater management.
Thank you.
A final question, perhaps? Oh, seeing none. Oh, is there one? Okay, sorry. Here comes the mic. Even though his name's Ray, it's the mic.
I'm curious about some of the assumptions. So one of the assumptions that you mentioned earlier was the idea that a livestock producer who had fallowed his hayfield would not buy supplemental grain, but would reduce his livestock herd. And so that's an assumption which I assume is based on the economics of the situation. If his livestock can be sold for more money than it would cost to get supplemental grain, he would make a different decision. So will you be going down like all those kind of little rabbit holes to explain why this assumption is being in place instead of a different assumption, or how a different assumption might result in a different economic analysis?
Well, I think that one is a particularly key assumption because, again, if we're talking about a program that focuses heavily on hay production and in an agricultural economy where livestock is the primary product, that's certainly one that we will want to look at in detail. And I don't think we've made any assumption at this stage about exactly how that'll play out. We, as I mentioned, in some of the basins, a lot of the hay is exported. So in those cases, it's certainly possible that reduction in hay production could result in reductions in exports rather than, or at least offsetting some of the potential impacts on the livestock production within the basin. So I think all of that's, we're still working on all of that, and it's, but yeah, I think we probably will have to do some sensitivity analysis on some of those things where it's very difficult to pin down exactly how the markets will work in those circumstances.
Yeah, and I think the point I was trying to make too is that just where you have grass pasture tied closely to cattle operations, that those longer-term economic impacts to your operation need to be considered. And if you choose to do a program like that in a year where it's a dry year, you also have to think, the time that it might take for your field to recover, or the fact that maybe the price of hay is going to be so exorbitant in a year like that, it's not going to make sense for you to go out and buy supplemental hay in order to make the numbers work, and what that compensation is for your reduced consumptive use. I mean, there's so many factors there, but thanks for your question.
Okay, that should wrap it up. You've been a great audience. Thank you very much. You've been emailed as we speak a survey electronically. Please fill it out. We'd like to know what you thought of what we're doing and what we should do perhaps in another year.